morning, church. How are we doing today? It's good to see everybody. Welcome to our Sunday service in the East region. For the entirety of this year, we have studied out many concepts about wisdom. It's a commodity that we need more and more of, and it's one that's become less and less value in our present society. And I think that Christians especially, who live in such a polarizing world, need to learn how to have deep convictions and be able to convey them with great wisdom in a world that's ready to take offense very easily, in a world that feels fear intensely, in a world that is ready to see things as black and white so quickly. Wisdom is all the more necessary. And under the banner of wisdom, we've studied out this concept of formation and the idea that as we learn wisdom, God is going to change us into something. He's going to form within us something. And he does that over the course of our life. And we started out by talking about the idea that we're formed by what we follow. What we spend our time doing, what we spend our time looking at, what we spend our time caring about is what forms us. If you spend 8 hours a day on social media, that's going to form you. Today, many of us plan to watch football, okay? I love football, but I tell you right now, watching that game, that forms you a little bit. All right? That has to be offset by following something more intensely than football. All right? But we started out talking about that, and then we talked about we're formed by what we think. What do we allow to come into our minds? What is it that we dwell upon? What do we watch? What do we spend our time reading and thinking about? That forms us. And then last week we talked about waiting and this concept that while being formed, we have to wait for it. All right? And I want to spend just a little bit of time reiterating some of that, because I think some of this is that we've got to realize that as we're being formed, it is God that is doing something within us. All right? It's not you doing something to become something. All right? You can't control your formation. All right? You can't hurt. My wife talked about suffering, not wanting to suffer. Guess what? You can't avoid it. All right? Suffering is a part of your formation. There's no way to control it. All right? You have to somehow ride out your suffering in the best way possible. All right? You can't hurry it. You can't manage your formation. God is doing something in us. And so while we have talked a lot about a lot of practical disciplines as it relates to formation, we've talked about not waking up and looking at your phone, like looking out a window for 10 minutes. Try that instead. Or turning off your phone for the first hour while you're awake, and spend some time thinking and praying and reading your Bible instead. We've talked about a lot of different practicals in those regards, but I want to emphasize those practicals give you no control over your formation. What they help you do is surrender to your formation. They help you accept your formation. And I think that today's message is built to help us cope with that fact, is being okay with the loss of control. Today, the title of today's message is Work is Worship. So work, ... is worship. Today we're wading into what I would personally call deep waters. If you know me, I love to have fun. I love mockery. That's a part of my language right there. If you're a guy and I mock you, you know that you're now my friend. Okay? Mockery is my form of affection. Okay? I love to hang out. What I don't love to do is talk about my feelings. If I say, let's hang out, what I'm not communicating to you. What I want to do is get some coffee and get deep. All right, that's not me. All right, I'm not saying I don't need that. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying that's not me. Okay, so what we're talking about today, to me, feels like deep waters. To you, this might feel like the shallows. Okay, but the kind of discussion today, is the difference between me understanding how to change a starter out of my car and understanding quantum physics. Okay? One thing you could read directions or watch a video for, and you could do. The other is it's like mysticism to me. Quantum physics, it might as well be magic, okay? Those two things are different for me, and today is a little bit mystical, all right? It's the difference between telling a joke and composing a poem, all right? there's greater nuance in today's subject. And I want to start by stating something here, but I don't want to get lost within a malaise of religious vocabulary. You know, I've been trying to follow in the steps of Jesus for almost 30 years now. And in that time, I have noticed a very specific kind of transformation take place within me. All right? And here's the transformation. I began with the practice of avoidance to protect my morality. Okay, so I avoided sin to protect my morality. But more and more, I practiced the avoidance of sin to protect my closeness and my peace. All right, we're going to get into that in a second. But, you know, we were taught to flee from sin. All right? This is a necessary habit, to flee from sin. Not to come even close to it. Not to flirt with sin. Not to be curious about it. But to run when we sense sin. All right, and I've had varying degrees of both success and failure with this command in the course of my lifetime. But the motivation to flee is what has been formed over time. At first, I would flee to protect my morality. I don't want to possess the blemish of sin. I don't want to feel guilt, and I don't want to feel shame. You know when you sin, and now you've just got a heavy burden that you're carrying? I don't want that. I don't want to live that way. I don't want to feel that way. And then, on top of all that, I don't want to confess it. Like, there have been many times where I have, been on the verge of sin, and then I've imagined having to confess it, and I'm like, it's not worth it. I don't want to talk about it, so I'm not going to do it, all right? But there's been this subtle change in me over the years. This change from avoiding sin, from protecting my morality, to protecting instead peace and closeness. And that has a lot more to do with the subject for today. But to begin with, before we get into this, let's talk about trees for a second, okay? Isaiah 55:12 says this, "You will indeed go out with joy and be peacefully guided. And the mountains and the hills will break into singing before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands." Psalm 65:12, "The grasslands of the wilderness overflow, and the hills are clothed with gladness. And the meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. And they all shout for joy, and they sing." Psalm 96:11, "Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad, and let the sea resound in all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes. He comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness." You know, there's this simple and penetrating idea that is conveyed in verses like these and elsewhere. Nature and all of creation is worshiping God all around us. You know, I love being in the woods. I love to be very far in the woods, like where there are no people, there's no cell signal, there's no sound of cars, there's no planes, you know, like far enough in the woods where if you died, it would be a thing. Like it would be hard to ever recover, okay? I want to be far away from people. And there's a certain thing that happens when all artificial noise goes away. And the only noise that exists is the noise that is made by creation itself. And one of my favorite sounds is the sound of wind in trees, in the canopy. And there's this thing that happens where you can hear the song coming, where the wind blows, and a quarter of a mile away you can start to hear the trees in the tops. And it gets louder, and it gets louder, and it breaks over you like a wave. And before you know it, the canopy itself is singing above you. And it's a very specific sound. And it's one of my favorite things. I've spent many afternoons deep in the forest without another soul or artificial sound to hear, listening to the sound of branches swaying and leaves quivering. And what we've just read is telling us that that sound is the sound of worship. That is the sound of praise. It is a type of shout. It is a kind of song. Isaiah 55:12 calls it a clap of the hands. Whether it's the tree swaying or the flowers blooming or the birds singing or the grass growing, the scripture says the same thing. It is creation worshiping its creator. To get up in the morning in silence and in reflection and go outside and see the bees in the flower or the snow cover the ground or the thunder roll across the sky is to watch the world worship its creator. And it's a privilege. Now, what does that have to do with our own formation? Well, it strikes me as interesting that the way the Bible describes nature worshiping God, it isn't as if the trees uproot themselves and jump up in the air. It's not as if the birds form a choir and harmonize with each other in perfect time. Nothing that is described is out of the ordinary at all. It's almost positively mundane in its normalcy. When nature does what it does, when nature does the only thing it ever does, when nature does exactly what it was created to do, it is worship. Creation worships God when it's doing exactly as it should. When nature functions in the way that it was created, it's worship from God's point of view. Hang with me for a second. Romans 12:1 says this, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God." This is your true and proper worship. We know this verse. We meditate on this verse. And you know, there's three ways in which the word body is used here. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices. There's three ways in which the word body can be used. One is just the actual physical body, your arms, your legs. Offer your physical body in worship. Number two, the carnal body. Offer the sensual part of your body, the old self, the sinful self. Sacrifice that to God. All right, Romans talks about that as well elsewhere. And then three, the figurative body. The heart, the mind, the soul, the entire self. You offer that up to God. Now, likely all three are intended by God here, and depending on what's going on in your life at that point, you choose which one you think is most applicable, okay? But I think he's saying something to ordinary people living out their lives as workers, as laborers, as homemakers, as leaders, as moms, as dads, as grandparents, the whole gambit. He is writing to people that get up and go to work every single day for the rest of their lives. And he's telling them to offer your whole self as an act of worship. Now, what does that mean? When you work, you worship. Colossians 3:22 says, it states it this way, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as though working for the Lord. So just like the trees, when they do what they were meant to do, they worship. Their work is their worship. When we work, no matter what we do, if we do it as for God, not for men, then we worship. You know, if your whole job was to put caps on bottles, okay? Now, I know nobody has that job in here. That's why I'm using it as an example. All right, but if your whole job was to put just caps on bottles of soda, that's what you did all day, just metal caps on bottles of soda, and you put those caps on straight, and you put them on tight, and you put them on correctly, and you put them on fast, and you do it all to the best of your ability, and you do it with that effort because you believe that by doing so, you're doing it for God, then you are worshiping in that moment. Even as you put caps on bottles. Just like the trees swaying in the wind. The most mundane work can become the most exalted worship if you've a mind and heart for it. You know, I've started doing this little thing. I've tried to perfect tying my shoes perfectly. All right? And so I've tried to, have you ever slowed down and tied your shoes? You almost forget how to do it. Like your hands know how to tie your shoes, your brain has forgotten. So when you try and slow down and just do it perfectly, like evenly, tightly, no folds, no wrinkles in the laces, try to do it. And I could care less about my laces. But I'm saying, I've done this, and I literally go, I'm going to tie my shoe perfectly for God. I'm going to make this little simple act an act of worship to God. And it's funny, I get done doing it, I feel so proud of my laces sometimes. Like right before I got up here, I untied one of my shoelaces, and I tied it again, and I said, are you guys with me at all? Is this weird? Okay. Have I gone off the rails here? But I said, I'm going to tie this as perfect as possible. All right? Sometimes when I run, and I get lost in the pain of running. Like sometimes running is I'm just trying to get through it at this point. And I often listen to books and I listen to music just to get through it. But there are times where I remember where I am. And I remember what I am. And I remember it's a privilege to be able to walk and to move my legs and to run. And for as long as possible, I say to myself, I am going to run for God in this moment. And I run with as perfect a form as I can. I run with as perfect of breathing as possible, as fast as possible, and I run for God for as long as I can keep my mind focused on it, which isn't long because pretty soon the pain takes over and you're almost cursing inside of your mind after a while. All right, but for a little while at least, let my running be worship. The other day I was doing the dishes as well. And it was it's amazing how the dishes add up in my house. I mean, it's incredible. And I don't know how, it's just a huge pile of dishes. And so I sat down to do the dishes, and I'm remembering that I'm writing this sermon. I go, I am going to make this the greatest dishwashing there's ever been. I'm going to wash these dishes perfect. I'm going to put them in the dishwasher the way that I think my wife wants them in the dishwasher. I'm going to place them perfectly. I'm going to wash the counters. I'm going to make sure there's not a speck of food on the counters. I'm going to make this perfect. And the only reason I'm doing this is because I want these clean dishes to stand as worship before God. Are you guys starting to get where I'm going here? When you go back to Romans 12, verse 1, it says this, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies, your whole self, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. It is this idea that when you learn to worship God, even as you tie your shoes, with everything that you're tasked to do, if you can worship God, it transforms you. If you can offer anything that you're doing, you may feel like you have the least important role in society. And yet, if you take that and you worship God with it, it is transformative. It is possible to worship all day long without ever having a religious moment. And I personally love that. I love the idea that my work can be the highest form of worship. Turn your office into a choir and make your desk a cathedral. Transform your task into an altar before God. It's possible to have every moment of your day infused with meaning. And this changes us. It rewires us. It makes all of us have a life full of meaning and wonder. Colossians 3, 1 through 4 says, since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Psalm 16, 8 through 9 says, I keep my eyes always on the Lord, With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices, and my body will also rest secure. This phrase, I will keep my eyes always in the Lord, it's a tough phrase to translate. It's translated also as keeping your eyes on the Lord is also translated as setting the Lord always before me. It's translated also as always letting the Lord guide me. The intentional effort to accept that God is with you in everything you do, is a discipline that changes you. So while you tie your shoes, the Lord is with you. While you sit here right now, the Lord is with you. When you get up to get a drink of water, he's with you. When you leave this place and you get in your car and you're driving in traffic with people who are acting as though there's nobody else has anything to do, the Lord is with you. And that understanding, that acceptance begins to change you, especially as you grow in your understanding of who God is. Because at first glance, the idea of God's presence always with us can feel a little confining. Like an overbearing teacher always looking over your shoulder. And yet, the more and more you understand who God actually is, the idea of his constant presence begins to bring peace to a person. He is always with you. So as you mow the lawn, do it with care and do it with intention as your act of worship because he is with you. As you do your homework, take your notes neatly because he is with you. Do your work well. It is your act of worship. You know, there's a movie from the early 80s called The Chariots of Fire, and popular movie. It's got a very popular soundtrack, as a matter of fact. And I like the movie. It's a movie about running, so I like it. But there's this one part in the movie where it's an Olympic runner. He's one of the best in the world, but he's devoutly Christian. He won't run on Sundays. He's always caught in between this ambition to be a great runner and his ambition to follow Christ. It's amazing that this movie won awards, to be honest with you. But the woman that he's in love with wants him to give up running and just go be a missionary, which is his calling in life. And at one point, he's informing her, I've accepted the missionary job to China. He goes, but before I go, I have a lot of running to do. And like her face kind of falls. And then he explains to her, you don't get it. Like God made me fast. I didn't make myself fast. And he has this quote, and he says, when I run, I feel his pleasure. To win is to honor him. What we do, when we do it well, brings God pleasure, brings God honor. What you do today when you go home, when you make your food for your loved ones, when you talk to your loved ones in, when you talk on the phone, when you serve your neighbors, you bring God pleasure when you do it well. As I've said before, start in small ways. Tie your shoes well. Tie your shoes as though God is with you. Do the dishes well. Mow the lawn as an act of worship. Drive home in perfect peace. Do not allow anyone to take your peace from you. There's a story, I've probably told this before, but I have a good friend of mine. He was telling me that he and his wife have never gotten in a fight. Now, this was like 10 years ago, so maybe that record's been broken at this point, I don't know. But he'd been married at that point like 15 years. And I was like, I don't believe you. What do you mean you've never gotten in a fight? I mean, you just pretend that you agree with each other all the time? And he's explaining to me the process he goes through to not get in a fight. And I was like, well, give me an example. He's like, I'll give you a good example. Because he had just moved. He was leading a church. And they had just moved to a new congregation. He was taking it over. And he's like, my wife is always late. Like, she doesn't matter. Like, time is like a ethereal concept to her, And we had our first leaders meeting with the lay leaders in the church. And I told my wife, I said, honey, listen, we can't be late for this. All right, these are the leaders. I do not want to be late for our first leaders meeting. All right, so please, honey, this is what time I'm getting in the car. All right, so I'm guessing you probably need to start thinking about getting ready by this time. He's trying to set it up. And he's like, sure enough, I'm trying not to nag. I don't want to push. There's a delicate balance between reminding and then crossing the line into annoying, and now you're fighting. And so he's trying to walk that balance. And he's like, sure enough, the time comes for us to leave, and she's not ready. He goes, that's all right. I made a buffer. I knew that this would happen. So I made like a little 5-minute buffer, but then the buffer is gone. And we get to the point where I know we're now going to be late for our very first meeting that we're having with this group of people who is volunteering to come in on the weekend for a meeting that I'm leading, that I will now be late for. And I'm like, what did you say? He's like, I didn't say anything. I was like, but weren't you mad? He was like, no. And I was like, how? And he said something that just blew me away. He's like, I would never let something so inconsequential steal my peace. Yeah, exactly. You can't just decide to do that overnight, though. You build on small things. So when you drive home today, don't allow any idiot out there to steal your peace. Drive home as an act of your worship. And soon you may find yourself spending hours every day working in worship and at peace. At the very start of this morning, I discussed the evolution of why I avoid sin today versus why I avoided sin as a younger man. As a young man, I avoided sin largely to protect my morality, to save myself from guilt and shame, which is good. That's not bad. That's good. Of course, this is still true for me today. I still don't want to feel guilt and shame. But now, a bigger motivating force is that I flee from sin to protect my peace. When your world, your body, yourself, your work becomes your worship, and you live in God's presence more and more, there is peace. There is closeness. There is a growing freedom from pressure. The pressure to be right, the pressure to look right, the pressure to perform, the pressure to succeed in what the world chooses to worship. And sin always disrupts this peace and closeness in ways that I hate. So I find myself fleeing from sin to protect myself, not from immorality, but to protect the peace and closeness that I have. And in fleeing sin, I run instead for peace and closeness. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Maybe for some of you, like me, these are deep waters. Like maybe what I'm talking about is so esoteric, it's not easy to put together. But some of our most important formation and change has to lie in the depths. And there is no water that we should ever fear treading into. His presence goes with us. Amen. Thank you very much. And do not forget to tie your shoes well on the way out of church today.